Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation which essentially covers the first half of the warm-ups for this particular cycle. Before we begin, please let me encourage you to open up to Google Classroom, once again by going to the Classwork tab, and then scrolling down to the section that says Warm-ups, and you're going to be working from the Warm-up Packet Quarter 2 Cycle 2 template, which is uploaded for you right here. Please be advised that when you click on the template, you'll see that it looks noticeably different, and that's mostly due in part to the fact that you have Thanksgiving break here right in between this cycle. So there's no question of the day or answer to the question of the day for Thursday and Friday of the first half of the cycle. And please be advised that these dates will be modified here to be Tuesday and Wednesday because you have that Monday off. So you can still expect 2 warm-ups next week, but please be advised that once again for this first half of the cycle, there is only 1 question and then 1 answer. So let's go ahead and get started, and then we should be good to progress forward. Okay, so in regards to the question of the day, let us direct our attention here, please, to Monday and Tuesday, 11:24 and 11:23. When we look at this question, this essentially leads us into the next half of the unit, where we're going to be looking at African history, especially after break. We're going to be looking at it more in depth. But for your lesson today, you're going to be looking at the early start of African history in the form of folk tales and folk art and, of course, proverbs and things of that nature that give us more insight into what early African history might have been like. What are the most important events that comprise to form Africa's history as a whole? So in other words, what are some of the key things that show us and tell us how Africa's history has developed and why has it developed the way that it's developed? Once you have that question written down, let's progress to the answer to the question of the day. So first, origins. Africa's early history was passed down orally, and native peoples spread throughout the continent. One of the things that most students may not know is that what separates, I think, Africa's history and culture from other cultures around the world that we're going to study is that much of their history, because it was passed down orally, has in many ways been subject to diverse interpretation and, of course, to, I guess you could say, widespread cultural diffusion. Now, when the native peoples spread throughout the entire continent, they also, of course, were able to set up different kingdoms that had characteristics all of their own. And that leads me to the next point here. The age of African kingdoms spans across many years. In fact, many mighty kingdoms sprang up all around Africa, and of course some were more successful than others, but some of the most iconic African kingdoms that you might be familiar with are Axum, Mali, Ghana, Kilwa, and Egypt. Also, for clarity, let's not forget about the great kingdom of Zimbabwe, which is also in the southern part of the continent too. Long story short, these kingdoms combine to form great success stories for Africa's history and culture that obviously show us that Africa's history is a lot more in depth than European colonization during those times. Slavery, of course, was a whole chapter in and of itself for the people of Africa. When tribal trade was established as a system by both, of course, North American and European superpowers, this basically uprooted whole populations from Africa systematically so that they were used in slavery as an institution. This, of course, had dramatic effects on the continent and its development and its culture when you think about it. And in many ways, slavery, of course, proved to be a huge detriment. What's interesting about this point here is that that's directly related to what happens next with colonization. European countries partitioned and drew up different lines and boundaries of Africa and in Africa, especially after many major power player countries met at the Berlin Conference. So, through direct and or indirect rule, these European superpowers, of course, had their hand in Africa for many years. But it wouldn't last, because of course then would come the age of decolonization. Decolonization is basically the opposite of colonization, and that African nations began to pursue paths towards independence with varying degrees of success. Some were more successful than others. For example, most students and people in general happen to know about, Nelson Mandela and the story of South Africa's fight for independence. But what you may not know is the differentiating levels of success that happens across Africa, as many of these decolonization movements happen around different figures, different factors, and different forces with different lasting legacies in mind. And that takes us to our final point. What is contemporary African culture and history like today? Well, in many ways, African countries have been both successful and unsuccessful at establishing, the essentials for a good, wholesome society. Good institutions, a good relationship with adapting to geography, and of course, culture. Now, while you type that last point down, let me just explain what I mean by that. It is true that when it comes to looking at Africa's history, we can spot many different points here of great success and great achievement, but we can also find, very sad moments of great detriment. For example, like civil wars and genocide. However, when we take an objective look at Africa's history as a whole, we can see a clear picture coming into view. And that is what we're going to be focusing on specifically throughout the rest of the unit. Please also be advised that for the lesson that coincides with this warm-up, you're going to watch a short video blast about what if Africa weren't colonized. And that'll get you really thinking about the factors of history that affect a culture inside and out. Thank you very much for tuning in. And remember that there is another presentation that's going to be uploaded later on for this warm-up packet cycle. Thanks.